Hello everyone, my name is Jennifer Minikowski and today I'll be doing my graduate presentation for Currins 545 about the research I've done into disciplinary literacy. So first I'd like to start out by explaining the differences between content area literacy, abbreviated CAL, and disciplinary literacy, DL. So, from one of our readings, the authors Lee and Spratley defined content area literacy as understanding content to understand the text and vice versa. Disciplinary literacy is more challenging as it is an advanced form of literacy in which different content areas require specific background knowledge in order to successfully read and comprehend a text. So, in other words, content area literacy could be applied across numerous disciplines, where disciplinary literacy is obviously discipline specific. Another text by Brozo provides a definition I think is easier to understand. They describe content area literacy as having an outside-in approach, which means building the foundational knowledge of reading and writing, but not necessarily knowing how to use it. Regarding disciplinary literacy, they state, disciplinary literacy evolves from the inside out. The text itself and the goals for reading the text dictate the reading processes. To represent these definitions, I chose the outside-in view of a fish tank for content area literacy because the viewer is just kind of looking at the fish tank in general, whereas for disciplinary literacy, we are looking from the inside out and are actually living and experiencing the fish tank, which I think of as the text. Alright, so with a background in science and my plans to become a science teacher, I chose to explore and research disciplinary literacy in science. Why is disciplinary literacy so challenging in science? Well, as Lab quotes, the language used in some scientific texts far exceeds the experience and reading ability of many students. So not only may it provide challenges on the disciplinary literacy side of things, students may also struggle in the content area literacy as well. Scientific texts incorporate their own language, including technical vocabulary and syntax, Latin and Greek quotes, multiple platforms of getting information across, such as through journals, articles, books, research, papers, and more. Plus, there are often charts, graphs, and figures that need to be interpreted. Scientists often include multiple points of view to emphasize their arguments. A reader must have math literacy skills as well. And finally, understanding multiple nested relationships is crucial to understanding overall concepts. So why should we bother with disciplinary literacy in science if it is so challenging for our students? Zwick and Gomez state, the presence or lack of literary skills will make a tremendous difference in a student's ability to understand political, social, and scientific issues. Likewise, a student's literacy skill level will have an impact on employability and life chances. Engaging in these practices to encourage the development of disciplinary literacy will help prepare students for becoming contributing members of society. I think this is especially important when thinking about everything that has gone on so far in 2020, such as COVID, wildfires in Australia, and the upcoming election. A lot of these things are based around science, and knowing how to properly interpret a text and determine its credibility is important, especially when kids nowadays are getting the majority of their information from TikTok videos. Having a more direct impact on one's teaching, Zwick and Gomez state, asking students to read and understand science content without providing and encouraging the use of strategic reading approaches like annotation can and frequently does result in poor understanding of content material, limited class discussion, and lack of interest in science. Without proper understanding of the text, students probably will struggle in your class if you ask them to read something and utilize that information on assessments or other projects. So overall, the benefits much outweigh the students' productive struggle with learning to become disciplinary literate in science. These are a few valued ways of creating, communicating, and sharing knowledge in science. It can be done through annotations, close reading, inquiry-based learning, drawing to learn, and the one we're probably most familiar with, journals and articles with the goal of reading, writing, and thinking like a scientist. My research led me to learn about annotation, which supports disciplinary literacy's premise of reading to learn. By using approaches like annotation, students learn to read more effectively and will learn content area topics more deeply. Annotation is a structured way to mark up a text so it is more manageable for students. The teacher will often provide his or her expectation of annotating in a chart, such as the one seen on the right of the screen, so that students have guidelines to follow. Throughout the year, more annotation steps will be added so as not to overwhelm the student right at the start. When sharing and researching and prior to experiments, scientists read texts and articles and use annotations to pick things out of the text that are of interest to them or that they have questions about. This helps students to start thinking and reading like scientists do. Plus, this technique is applicable to other readings as well. Like sometimes when I'm reading an informative book, I'll highlight or underline things that I want to come back to or have questions about. So annotating is really something that is beneficial to all students. We've talked about close reading before, but my research really showed why close reading is important in science. Close reading represents one type of reading in which students have a go at a text becoming the primary investigator of its meaning. This allows students to become more independent when reading text. Instead of doing a little teaching or exploring prior to reading the text, students just jump right in. This method allows students to dig deeper into text on their own and become disciplinary literate more quickly. Students also like to do things independently, so many of them really enjoy this method of reading and learning. Close reading is a way to scaffold a text through the steps noted on the right, which explains how we do it. First, choose a text. Next, provide a question for students to answer after their first reading. Then have a discussion. Encourage students to annotate portions of the text as they read a second time through and answer another question that you provide. Monitor students during their reading in case they have any questions. It is up to the teacher how many times the text will be read, but often at the end, a good conclusion is to have students summarize what they read. We all know what inquiry-based learning is, but most of us probably think of it as doing an activity first. However, an article I read showed how using a scientific text as the activity can actually benefit students in terms of developing their content area literacy and disciplinary literacy. As Pearson states, when science literacy is conceptualized as a form of inquiry, reading and writing activities can be used to advance scientific inquiry rather than substitute for it. When literacy activities are driven by inquiry, students will learn how to read and write at the same time they are learning about science. Scientists also use text prior to doing any experimentation, so by doing this in the classroom, one is helping their students to think and act like a scientist. Also, science and literacy both use many of the same reasoning processes, such as setting purposes, questioning and clarifying things, making inferences from evidence, and making arguments. So really, scientific text and inquiry go hand in hand. Plus, reading prior to doing something hands-on can provide additional support to students. On the right is an example of how text can be incorporated into an inquiry-based lesson. Through reading, doing, talking, and writing, all aspects are important to becoming disciplinary literate, become included within that lesson. The goal of all this disciplinary literacy is to have our students read, write, and think like scientists. The best way to do this is through using text similar to what a scientist would use. When a student is reading to learn and investigate, there are so many opportunities for them to have a productive struggle, which will result in their reading becoming more developed and they will find more meaning in the text. Savetti and Pearson state, Reading, interpreting, and producing text are fundamental practices of science in particular, and they constitute at least half of engineers' and scientists' total working time. With that much time being spent in the real world working with texts, we need to make sure our students are proficient in working with them. Also, experts approach texts differently depending on their discipline, which is why disciplinary literacy is again so important to teach our students. Scientists in specific tend to be more questioning and examine the credibility of text and what procedures went into the text, which goes well with teaching science texts in an inquiry-based manner. The utilization of textbooks takes away a student's opportunity to explore through inquiry and instead portrays science as a set of facts. Texts make science smarter when they support rather than eclipse involvement in inquiry and other forms of meaning-making, states Cervetti and Pearson. Drawing to learn is probably my favorite thing I learned about during this research project. It helps make the unseen seen and the complex simple. Why is drawing so beneficial to learning, though? First, it is a powerful tool for thinking and communicating regardless of the discipline. And second, it is a process skill that is integral to the practice of science, used when generating hypotheses, designing experiments, visualization and interpretation of data, and communicating results. As I mentioned before, scientific texts can be challenging because they have a lot of visuals integrated within the text. So drawing to learn can aid students in becoming visually literate through doing their own practice. It should also be noted that students learn more from combining verbal and visual information than from just verbal information alone. Plus, as a teacher, it's fairly simple to assess the students' understanding from their visualizations. Finally, how do we scaffold drawing skills into our curriculum? On the right are some examples from biology of how drawing can be utilized for structures, processes, and relationships. Overall, through drawing to learn, it should gain more knowledge because drawing is a science process skill, and with practice it will lead to better learning and increased disciplinary literacy in science. Here are some discipline-specific terms and concepts that must be understood in order to make meaning within the science discipline. Experiment is a scientific procedure in order to make a discovery, test a hypothesis, or demonstrate something already known. Conclusion means the overall result from an experimental procedure. Prediction is a statement forecasting what would happen under specific conditions. Hypothesis is a proposed explanation made on the basis of limited evidence as a starting point for further investigations. Cycle is a recurrent series of events or processes. Control is something that is not manipulated during an experiment for comparison's sake, and variable is something manipulated during an experiment. So how can we build disciplinary literacy knowledge into our practice? The first way is through the use of infographics. As we learned, there are many benefits to using infographics. These include students experiencing the discovery process about the topic they are learning about through creating the infographic, acquiring disciplinary knowledge through its creation, using multiple sources, and answering questions as they arise. I think infographics are similar to what I learned about drawing to learn because it provides a visual representation of information. Also, infographics can be used to scaffold a student's understanding of how to read a text with a scientist's mindset, because an infographic requires students to pick out and display the most relevant information from an article. And then on the left, there's just an infographic example for you. Another way which we can build disciplinary literacy knowledge is through the use of graphic organizers. I provided an example of a graphic organizer for science on the right. Graphic organizers provide students for a purpose for their reading and provide an organized manner to keep track of their notes. This helps students think like a scientist too because they are visualizing complex relationships on paper. And here's my works cited in case you're interested in looking at any of the articles I used for my research. I hope that you learned a lot about disciplinary literacy in science. Thank you.